Namaskar. In the author series of Vishwarang 2020, it gives me great pleasure to welcome one of Singapore's top strategic thinkers in international affairs. Professor Kishore Mahbubani really needs no introduction, but let me share some highlights of his illustrious journey. Of Indian origin, he is a Singaporean civil servant with two distinct careers. As a diplomat, he spent over 30 distinguished years at Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As an academic, from 2004, he served as founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He's also a prolific writer who has spoken in many corners of the world. His most recent book on the changing global order is titled Has China Won?, which was released in April this year. It's a fascinating book which has tackled critical global issues head-on and very candidly. Welcome, Professor Mahbubani. It's indeed a privilege and an honor to have you join Vishwarang 2020.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, when you penned Has China Won?, the current pandemic was not even on the horizon. Subsequent events, especially America's response to COVID-19, may have tilted the global balance even more in China's favor. So my first question to you is, would you have written the book any differently a year later?
That's a very good question. Actually, the pandemic could have completely destroyed my book. For example, if it showed that the United States was far more competent in its management of COVID-19, and the Chinese system, which is in theory rigid, dictatorial, inflexible, could have failed in response to COVID-19. So then I guess people would have said, this book is get thrown away. But sadly, COVID-19 has actually confirmed many of the key points that I make in my book, which is that the United States is making a huge strategic mistake in underestimating China and the capabilities that China has developed. And, Warren Buffett very famously said once, it's only when the tide goes out that you discover who's naked.
That's right.
So I think the COVID-19 basically is like that kind of a tide going out, and it's actually shown how formidable the state capacities of the Chinese government are. And sadly, it's also shown how incompetent the US governmental structures have become in response to COVID-19 virus. I explain in my book why these incompetences come about. As I say, this is a contest between a meritocracy in China and a plutocracy in the United States. And in many ways, COVID-19 has actually confirmed the strengths of the Chinese meritocratic system, and actually, unfortunately, also confirmed the weaknesses of the American plutocratic system. So
The bottom
much as I don't celebrate COVID-19, COVID-19 has confirmed the main thesis of my book. Yeah.
True. No, that's true. As I was reading it, which was in April, I was, it kind of in the context of the unfolding pandemic, and I was in the US at Stanford University at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I just found it almost, like I said, visionary in the way it played out, and unfortunate. And the bottom half of the American society and the world over, of course, but the American society especially has really suffered, and that's the plutocracy you mentioned. That's very true, Professor. You, in the book, you do talk about the choice various countries are making in this bipolar world. Given that Vishwarang has going to have a lot of Indian participants, the audience would love to hear your perspective on the choice India may make in a world where China either wins or loses. So whose side should Bharat be on, America or China?
Well, I think the answer is very easy. Bharat should be in favor of only one country in the world, which is India.
Right.
And in all countries should pursue their own national interests. And India should not be serving the interests of either America or China. India should put India's interests first. And actually, the US-China geopolitical contest has created a magnificent geopolitical opportunity for India. Huge, because they're basically we are entering a world where there are three major powers. I mean, number one is clearly still United States. Number two is China, and the third most important power in the world today, without a doubt, is India. And so, when a geopolitical contest begins, I compare it to a seesaw.
Mhm.
So if you have a seesaw with two elephants, China on one side and India and America on the other side, the best position for India to take is to stand in the middle of the seesaw. So wherever India puts its foot, that's where the balance goes. And that's exactly the kind of geopolitical positioning that China did in the Cold War. In theory, China initially was an ally of the Soviet Union, but as you know, he shifted away and also became friends with United States. And therefore, by having good links with United States and Soviet Union, China could be the swing factor in the Cold War. And the Americans cultivated China assiduously because they knew that China was a swing factor. So in similar ways, if India can be perceived as a swing factor, then both America and China will then have to cultivate India, sorry,
Yeah.
very seriously. So I would say that therefore there's a huge geopolitical opportunity for India. But what India needs is great strategic thinkers like a Henry Kissinger, George Kennan to advise it. But of course, as you know, strategic thinking has been very much part of Indian strategic culture, going back from Kautilya
That's right.
to the Mahabharata. There are all kinds of lessons you can learn, from there. So I think this I see this as a tremendous opportunity for India.
And in your view or assessment, is the political leadership, the foreign minister who knows this area, of course, and the prime minister are would kind of be looking at it the way you are looking at it as well? In terms,
I think both Prime Minister Modi and Foreign Minister Jaishankar, I think, understand the geopolitical game very well. And I would say Prime Minister Modi demonstrated it by spending so much time in his meetings with President Donald Trump and with Prime Minister Xi Jinping. So I think you could see it from the way Prime Minister Modi behaved. He understood that he had to have good links with President Donald Trump and good links with President Xi Jinping. But as you know, unfortunately, we had the incident on June 15, 2020, which was a sad incident, and it shows you how history is often driven not just by people but by events.
you're talking about the
And that
missing
event clearly changed the nature of the discourse in India. Right now, I understand, I haven't been to India recently, but there's a huge wave of anti-China sentiment in India. And so it ties the hands of Prime Minister Modi, ties the hands of Foreign Minister Jaishankar, because then they have to be perceived to be standing up to China and so on and so forth. See, but I hope that over time, as tempers cool, I think one of the key points I make is that as you mentioned, I spent 33 years in the Singapore Foreign Service in practicing geopolitics. And the biggest lesson in geopolitics is that if you react emotionally, you lost the game completely. You must be very cool, calm, and cunning in dealing with geopolitics.
Sure.
And that's why I hope that India will calm down and see not just the dangers from this US-China geopolitical contest, but also see the opportunities. And as you know, if you read Jai Shankar's book, he's come out with a new book the India way. He says that if everyone sees that India is a member of the Quad,
Mhm.
so it's a member of the Quad with US,
Japan.
Japan, Australia, and so therefore seen to be pro-American. But then he adds in the book, he said, but India is also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has a trilateral discussion with China and Russia. So India is friendly with all parties, and I think that's India's biggest strategic advantage is that nobody distrusts India.
Sure.
Everybody trusts India. So that's a wonderful advantage that India has, and that trust gives India a tremendous amount of opportunities.
Indeed. No, that's very well put, and I think we all hope that,
Mm,
uh, as you said, cooler minds prevail, and the
mm,
pressures of democracy and politicking, which also you discuss in the book,
mm,
are not overridden or override
mm.
this short-term decision making the policymakers. It's interesting. You also talk in your book about the possible friendship or alliance between the USA and the USSR,
Mm,
Russia,
mm.
which is very convincing, and it's a great argument. I mean, I haven't seen that too often.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, my book has got several surprising elements, and frankly, as you know, Gorbachev tried very hard. He created this concept of the common house of Europe.
Mhm.
And he said that Russia should have a European destiny, and that is an age-old aspiration in Russia. You go back to Tolstoy; it's there. But unfortunately, as you know, at the end of the Cold War, the biggest mistake the West made was to drown in hubris and arrogance. And so, as a result of the hubris and arrogance, instead of treating Russia with magnanimity after winning the Cold War, they continued to humiliate Russia
Right.
after the end of the Cold War and continued expanding NATO, bringing NATO right to the doorstep of Russia. And I can understand why the Russians would be very, very uncomfortable. And I think India also understands this because if you have foreign powers supporting countries in the neighborhood, you feel uncomfortable too. So India can understand that. So it's in many ways the West has been very unwise. So which is why I suggest in my book that in the long run, the biggest challenge for Russia is not United States America. United States America is so far away. The biggest challenge for Russia is China because it shares a 1,000-mile border with China. So of course the Russians have got to balance. And so if the West was wiser in the way it handled Russia, then it would be much better off. And if you look, I know in my book, I say, ASEAN and Vietnam were fighting each other ferociously. And I was involved as ambassador at the UN fighting the Vietnamese delegation over the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. But when the Cold War ended, within 5 years, ASEAN had admitted Vietnam into ASEAN. And why didn't the European Union do the same? And see, the Europeans cannot even think of the idea that they can learn from Asians lessons in geopolitics. But I think we can teach the Europeans a
Right.
lesson or two.
Moving on to something quite different, you discuss the reserve status enjoyed by the US dollar and it being a potential Achilles heel for America.
Mm.
Given the speed of technological innovation, disruption that we're witnessing, along with America's wide and growing deficits, when do you see a potential change to this world order? Quite simply, how and when can China topple the US dollar?
Well, I think the US dollar will remain the global reserve currency for a long time. There is no immediate threat to it. But when I say there's no immediate threat to it, I do not say there is no threat to it. And so what I point out in the book is that there might be a threat to it. And the advantage of having the US dollar as the global reserve currency is that the United States is the only country that can live beyond its means. The Chinese people have to work very hard, put together all the component parts, and this phone arrives, right, in the US. And all that the Americans have to do is print a few dollars and they get the phones, right? It's a very good deal if you have the dollar as a global reserve currency. But for it to survive as a global reserve currency, it should not be used as a weapon by the United States to punish countries which use the US dollars. And as you know, United States does not just punish its enemies, it punishes allies. And BNP, if I'm not mistaken, please check this,
Yes.
had to pay a fine of $9 billion. Now, let me repeat that, is billion, not million. $9 billion
Yeah.
because BNP was using US dollars to trade with Iran. BNP was not breaking any international law, not breaking UN sanctions, but breaking American laws. This is extraterritorial application of American laws overseas. And it's not wise. I mean, I say this all, I say all these things, I emphasize, as a friend of the United States. I'm not an enemy of the United States. I'm telling the United States, it's in your interest to preserve the reserve status of the global of the US dollar. And the best way to preserve reserve status is not to weaponize it and use it against your friends and adversaries. And so in that sense, I'm giving friendly advice, because if the world begins to turn against the US dollar, increasingly they will find that they can find alternatives, And one example I gave in my book, right now, as you know, Argentina sends soybean to China, and China sends maybe clothes to Argentina. But the way they trade is they use US dollars, right? Because
Yeah.
it's the only global reserve currency.
Yeah.
All you need, if you have very smart blockchain technology,
Exactly.
you can actually create a unit of value that replaces the US dollar.
Yeah.
And if countries begin to do that, then the status of the global reserve currency is threatened, and therefore it can become, as you said in your question, the Achilles heel of the United States. And so I'm actually trying to protect the Achilles heel of the United States.
No, it's a point very well made. Being a former banker myself, the joke used to be that America funds its deficit by, penalizing and fining the banks.
Mm,
And as you said, the fines were in billions, and
mm,
were exactly on the issues that you mentioned. I personally saw that as well, and so on. So, well, good point. Thank you. Just moving on to the other issue around China,
mm,
and that concerns many in the West and here, especially those in the younger generation, which is that in the pursuit of economic greatness,
mm,
China seems to be moving further in a direction which is antithetical to what are termed as liberal democratic values of free speech, human rights, data privacy, etc. Are you worried about that at all? And how do we reconcile the achievements of China with the alleged human rights violations that they come in, that they're supposed to be doing? Where is the line? And if I could, on a related, just ask you the question about where do you see an end game for Hong Kong?
mm.
But if I could
Okay.
ask you the first bit first.
Well, I mean, I'll answer the question on Hong Kong later, but let me address the broad question of human rights. I studied philosophy, Western philosophy, and the even if you study American political philosophers, the greatest recent American political philosopher is John Rawls.
Mhm.
And, the traditional political philosophers, they never just emphasize freedom. It was freedom and equality.
Right.
These were the two cardinal values. And what's happened is that in the United States, there has been a total imbalance because they've emphasized the freedom and forgotten the equality.
Right.
So as a result of that, the United States is the only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over the past 30 years. As you know, I document this
Mhm.
in my book and provide the data. So if you, John Rawls had a very interesting, how do you say, question to decide which society is most just. He said, if you were blind and you didn't know which society you're going to be born in, And if you, yeah, but you might suddenly be born in the bottom 10% of United States or the bottom 10% of China. Which society would you choose? Now, in theory, you would choose America because it has all the political freedoms and opportunities. But actually, if you're born in the bottom 10% in America, your chances of ending up in jail are the highest in the world.
The incarceration.
Because America has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the imprisoned. And especially if you're born a poor African American, you will lead a very rough life. Your chances of dying in violence are very high. So you're better off being born in the bottom 10% in China, because the bottom 10% in China have now seen the greatest improvement in their lives over the past 40 years, the greatest improvement in 40 years over 4,000 years of Chinese history. So this is the criteria used. So what happens in the discussions about human rights and freedom and everything is that you look at the top 10%. And of course, the top 10% in America, actually the top 1% in America, are the best in the world. No question whatsoever.
That's the American exceptionalism, I
Yeah.
guess. Yeah.
But if you look at the bottom 10%, really you don't want to be born in the bottom 10%, because in America, life expectancy has gone down, infant mortality has gone up. And so life is terrible for the bottom 10%. So that's why when you talk of human rights, and if you talk to any of the political philosophers, the great political philosophers, what they would, even Adam Smith, even Hume, even Locke, they were all focused on social justice. And as you know, I quote so many American writers which have pointed out that as a result of these deteriorating conditions of the bottom 50%, there's a sea of despair among the white working classes in America. So if you ask yourself a simple question: which society is happier society? Is it American society or Chinese society? Chinese society today is a much happier society than uh, American society is. So this is what human rights at the end of the day, and this is also what I quote in the book. It's about improving human welfare and human well-being, right? There's no point having all the legal rights and your life gets worse. And it's true in China, you don't have political freedoms of the kind that America has, and certainly you go to jail if you criticize President Xi Jinping. In America, you don't go to jail if you criticize President Donald Trump. But at the same time, if you think in terms of personal freedoms, and I remember when I first went to China in 1980, 40 years ago, the Chinese people couldn't choose, where to live, where to work, what to study, none of the, what to wear, they couldn't choose, Today, you go to China, the Chinese people can choose what to wear, where to live, where to work, what to study. And guess what? Each year, 130 million Chinese leave China freely, and 130 million Chinese go back to China freely. So they're enjoying a personal freedoms and not political freedoms. And that's a choice that the Chinese people are making. And all I can say is, if the Chinese government is really hard, dictatorial, oppressive, the Chinese people will overthrow them. This has been a 4,000-year rule in Chinese history. When the emperor is oppressive, the people overthrow the emperor. So this is the balance that each society has to maintain. And I would say it's right for America to choose the system it has for America. It's right for China to choose the system it has for China. And why should we decide? Chinese people can decide what's good for them. The American people decide what's good for them. And we in Singapore decide what's good for us. And as you know, for a long time, the American media was so critical of Singapore, and saying, no, we are an oppressive state and so on and so forth. And ironically, there are Americans giving up their citizenship now to become Singapore citizens.
It is the irony.
Which is amazing, isn't it?
Okay, let me move on to our last question. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, Professor. Uh, you start the book with this fictional memo to Xi Jinping, which is a fascinating memo. Could I ask you for a similar memo or an advice to the next US president? And as we're recording this, we don't know who that is going to be, but I think by the time this interview goes out, we may know who it is. But could I ask you to
Well, if the next if President Trump wins again, he's not going to listen to any advice. So there's no point giving advice to Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump wins, then he will create a lot of short-term pain for China, but it'll be a long-term gain for China. Because one of the most senior influential Western figures said to me in private, said, Kishore, if Donald Trump is re-elected, the West is dead, you know. So, I mean, he's clearly going to be a disaster. But if Joe Biden's elected, it provides a magnificent new opportunity for the United States of America. And I'm therefore you can see I'm hoping that Joe Biden is elected because I want America to become strong. Again, I don't want America to be weak. I think a strong America is good for the world, not a weak America. And so, but I would say that my advice to him is to go back and study what the previous American strategic thinkers had given advice to America. And the man who formulated America's strategy in the Cold War was George Kennan. And he gave 4 pieces of advice. And those 4 pieces of advice are still valid today. First piece of advice, he says the outcome of the Cold War with the Soviet Union or the contest with China today will not depend on the number of bullets and bombs you have. It will depend on the spiritual vitality of our domestic society. And right now, as I document, American society doesn't enjoy domestic vitality. So why has America spent $5.1 trillion fighting unnecessary wars in the Middle East, when if you had taken the $5.1 trillion and given it to the bottom 50% in America, each citizen in the bottom 50% would receive a check for $30,000. Use the money to help your own people. Taking care of your people is more important than American primacy. The second piece of advice he gave is that cultivate friends and allies. So I would say, don't do what Trump did. Talk to your friends and listen to your friends, because many of your friends are saying, for now, pause your geopolitical contests. Focus on fighting COVID-19. The third piece of advice he gave is, don't insult your adversary. So don't insult Soviet Union, don't insult China, because you got to work with them. And the fourth piece of advice he gave, he said, be modest. Be like Mahatma Gandhi or Rabindranath Tagore. Be modest. So I think that's the advice I would give to the next president of the United States, and I hope you'll be Joe Biden.
Thank you, Professor. It's been a fascinating discussion. We're coming to the end of our time, and it's very apt that you end on Guru Dev's words with Rabindranath Tagore being mentioned. It's been really very insightful, very enriching for myself and for the audience, I'm sure. I would strongly recommend the book as a must-read for all those who want a glimpse on
Has China won?
China One, yes, on what the world has in store for us in the next few decades and maybe the century. Thank you so much for your time, Professor, for participating in the festival. Namaskar. Thank you.